welcoming you all to Merit Education Rounds. I will remind you all that we do record our events. We started recording our education rounds earlier this year to archive our speakers' talks, and we're continuing even though we are now in a virtual context. So hopefully you're all okay with that. Today we have invited Dr. Partovi to share some of his expertise around the value of artificial intelligence in medical education and medical research. However, I'm just going to take a moment to point out some exciting events as well. So if you're not familiar with our program, Merit, which is the McMaster Education, Research, Innovation and Theory program within the Faculty of Health Sciences at McMaster, hosts a number of events to help bring together this community of practice, to connect people and just build a broad network around education, research, and scholarship. So you can go to merit.mcmaster.ca to learn about all of the activities. You may be interested in joining our program as a member. There are different levels of membership that you may want to entertain. We also have the opportunity to present some of your scholarly ideas to some of our experts so that we can help you build your own research. I will just take a moment to highlight the three upcoming events. One being tomorrow, and that is with the Insight U group. The focus for that group is discussion around SIM-based education and assessment. And tomorrow we've got a speaker who's going to talk about how we measure transfer of learning in that context and some challenges for teaching and assessment around transfer. On November 3rd at noon, we're having a luncheon lab session with Dr. Lara Barpio, who's going to share some very interesting stories around her challenges for developing interprofessional education research. And why she's just going to throw in the hat and sort of give up on it. So join us then and bring your lunch and listen to what she has to say. On the 17th is our rescheduled Sibley lecture. So those of you who are aware, it was previously scheduled for April and we had to cancel that. It would have been an in-person event on campus. So we're going to have this as a virtual session. Dr. Will Bynum will be talking about shame and sentinel emotional events for medical learners. So that's November 17th at 5 p.m. You can find the links for all those events at merit.mcmaster.ca. So at this point, I'm going to hand things off to Dr. Teresa Chan because she knows a little something about artificial intelligence and the use of tech and innovations, and she's going to help introduce our guest speaker.
Hello, everyone. I am all decked up with my tech gear here just to show that off a little bit. No, just kidding. But I'd like to welcome you all to Merit. Hopefully I sound okay with this fancy microphone. But really what it comes down to is I'm here to introduce a new friend of mine who is someone that I met a little over a year ago on a panel discussion around tech and healthcare. And I thought that he would be a great person to bring in for rounds. And Dr. Shez Partovi is here, and he is the worldwide lead of healthcare, life sciences, and genomics at Amazon Web Services. So it's known by the cool kids as AWS, just so you know. And so he might use that short form a little bit because he's obviously a cool guy. But he trained at McGill University and completed his neuroradiology subspecialty at the Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, Arizona. He's been a serial entrepreneur and has launched a number of health IT companies, one of which was a telehealth company built on AWS. He has actually practiced clinically as a radiologist, but has recently transitioned into an executive role at Dignity Health, where he serves as the Chief Information Officer and subsequently the Chief Digital Officer and of the digital transformation. He oversaw the deployment of Cerner, which is a major electronic medical records for those who don't understand or know much about the EHR space, because some of us still chart with paper. He's then also worked across a number of different settings to help with that. He joined the AWS team in 2018 as the worldwide lead for healthcare, life sciences, and genomics, and has been working with a dozen of large-scale initiatives across the globe to bring a unique perspective that he has as someone who's been a practicing clinician and is now in the tech space. So thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully I did justice to your awesome bio, but I don't think I really can, but you've got quite a story and it's amazing. So I'll let you take it away there, Dr. Partovi.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Drs. Chan and Montero. It's a delight to be virtually back in Canada. To tell you that presenting McMaster, of course, when I was in McGill, we were always thinking that which is the better medical school, but we really do know, don't we? Either way, it's a real delight, and I'm pleased to be here with you today to talk about, let me just bring up the slides, and really try to make it actually just a more very natural and casual to tell you a bit about AI and ML, machine learning. I'll say AI and ML all the time. It's just easier than artificial intelligence and machine learning. And then also give examples in education, as well as in research, and give some examples even from across Canada. And so that's sort of the intent. And just before I start, since Teresa mentioned that some of you may or may not actually be familiar with AWS, it's the technology arm of Amazon. And it runs all the cloud computing technology. It's been around for about 14 years. It has a dedicated healthcare life science practice focused on modernizing health systems, modernizing pharma, biotech, medical device, modernizing genomics and so on, genomic companies. And it's been around for about 7 years, and really a terrific team of clinicians and nurses and physicians and so on that have come from either the bench or the bedside to come and practice and work with organizations actually like McMaster, like Vancouver General Hospital, like others. And one of the things that in this, despite having come to the technology side, one of the things that our team in the healthcare life science practice at Amazon really never forgets is that all the organizations we work with, sort of this icon salad that's going by, we actually never forget that each one of them has in their mission or vision statement or their charter a reference to the same word, either a person or an individual or a patient, member, a citizen. We recognize that in the healthcare life science practice, what we do helps really ultimately organizations elevate the human condition. So that's really important to us, a part of our vision. So I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about prediction and using AI ML to predict things, and then try to demystify AI ML a bit, and then shift gears, give some examples in education, and shift gears and give some examples in research of the kinds of things that we're doing, whether across the world or in Canada. And so let's begin with prediction. And the reason prediction is really important, particularly in healthcare, is because we are data rich and insight poor. And this is, we as in healthcare. And what I mean by, let me give you an example. So if you think of a blood sugar value as being data, and if you have a number of blood sugar values, you trend a graph, it's information. It's more, there's more there than just a single snapshot data point. And so that's information, for example, trending, rising blood sugar values. What we want to do always, of course, is go from information to knowledge, which is, let's say, the knowledge that the patient has diabetes. But what really is transformative is to be able to predict that the patient will have vision loss in 18 months. And this idea that you have an ocean of data, but what you're really looking for is what insights does that data give you? How can you care for individuals better with those insights? That's the journey that machine learning and AI and ML can get you going on. And in fact, a lot of times there's a lot of fear, uncertainty, doubt in the industry around, oh, AI is going to replace physicians. And really what we see over and over again is that it is another tool that provides data to physicians and clinicians to use their training and their cognitive skill to make a decision about patient care. And so we'll look at some of those examples. But really, this is the journey we see everywhere, this idea of how do I unlock value within data and to go from data to information, information to knowledge, and ultimately use that knowledge, use that data to create predictions. So let's address one thing. You may say, well, what even gives Amazon the permission to be in this space? What heritage do you have that makes you think you can provide predictions in healthcare and help us, help you do predictive things? Well, we've had a long heritage of machine learning. If you wonder how Amazon might recommend something, it's based on machine learning. In fact, if you wonder how Amazon can deliver within a day or deliver within hours, it's because we actually predict at massive scale, at global scale, what people are going to order before they order it. And we actually move the material to their closest fulfillment center before the order is placed, so that when the individuals or that community places those orders, it is in the shortest distance to be delivered. That's how much we depend on AI ML and how much we've been using and perfecting it. And what we've done now is really wrapped a regulatory framework of patient and consumer privacy and made it available to health systems. And in fact, if you think of how Netflix guesses what movie you might like next, it's using the same engine. If you imagine how when you used to travel, how Expedia will recommend your next trip, it's based on the same engine. So we have the same machine learning engine that we would use ourselves at Amazon.com or at Netflix, is now available to health systems, to health authorities to use that to advance healthcare. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly is machine learning. In other words, when we talk about machine learning, what do we really mean? In case you haven't come across, an AI ML sort of terms. The way I'm going to use a diagram to explain this. And so if you and I are that wheel, and we have information that comes into our brain, and based on our training, we make a decision, something yes, something no. You probably as clinicians do it every day, making clinical judgments. But even, is it a bicycle or a tricycle? You've learned as a young age, it's got 2 wheels, a bicycle, 3 wheels, a tricycle. And so this idea that information comes to us, we use our knowledge and learning to make a decision, is sort of how, if I were to give an example, in CT hospital units, you know that air is less than 1,000. If you're a radiologist or a neuroradiologist like me, you'll know that fat is between minus 50 to 100. You've learned this. And so if you put a region of interest on a CT scan, based on your learning, you're making a decision of what it is. Now let's look at machine learning and AI. So machine learning is different, where we give information, data to a machine and give it the answer. We label the data, we train it. So in this case, look at that diagram up top where it goes to a cognitive skill and we make a decision. Now we give it, let's say, a picture and put a region of interest over an air bubble and say, that's air. We don't tell it about the hospital units. We just say, that's air. Put over a bone, say, that's bone. We do this over and over again. And then the machine itself builds a model that isn't dependent necessarily on hospital units. It's just based on the labeling. And then if you take that model and give it an image it's never seen before, it can tell you what's air and what's bone. If you look at the bottom right and compare it to what you do in the top left, you can see why people call it artificial intelligence, because you've been educated and you make decisions. We train a model, and then the model appears to be making decisions based on the data that it gets. So this is the heart of training a model to behave this way. So now you may say, well, CT hospital units are easy. It's more like if this, then that, because they're so linear. It's discrete, that's the word. Because if less than 1,000, then air. So those are very discrete. Let's talk about non-discrete to give you an example of the power. So what we did with Cerner, which is the largest electronic health record company in the world, we took 210,000 de-identified data, individuals data, and went through, and there were 21,000 patients that have congestive heart failure in that data set, and we labeled those. We said, here's the data for this person's longitudinal record. That one has CHF, that one has CHF. We didn't tell it anything else other than the patient's longitudinal record. It had access to it and just said CHF, 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 because they'd already developed CHF. And the machine built a model. And then we took that model and introduced to that model 3,000 individuals that had, again, individuals that had developed CHF, but the model had never seen before. So these 3,000 were not part of that 210,000 training set. There were 3,000 unknowns. And we told the model, here are 3,000 unknowns. When are these people going to develop CHF? And if so, when? And the model could predict congestive heart failure 15 months prior to onset in this, with an area under the curve accuracy of 0.915, which if you do research, you'll know AUC of 91.5% is pretty darn good. And so this, you have to imagine now, if you're in clinical workflow working on an electronic health record, and a patient comes to the emergency department, And face up, the model looks at the prior admissions of this patient for the past 12 months and says, face up, there's a prediction, a probability this person is going to develop CHF. And that's the point I was trying to make earlier. It's not making the diagnosis, it's providing a probability for your likelihood upon which then you as a clinician can decide how you, just like you use a CBC, electrolytes, and a chest x-ray and a CT scan as a decision, it becomes an input to your decision-making process. And so that's an example of training on a data and then building a model. Now let's dive a little bit deeper and just say, well, how exactly does that happen? Let's just double click on that. Oh, actually, this is a great example. Let me give you the VGH example, going across country to Vancouver General. They wanted, when COVID hit, the team there was in the radiology department, was a head of physician, Dr. Sebas Nicolau, who actually he and I trained together because I did my residency in Vancouver. And one of the residents, Will Parker, Dr. Will Parker, they basically took data, CT scan and chest CTs and EHR data and built a model, labeled it, this one has COVID, that one doesn't have COVID, and actually brought data from other parts of the world. And then were able to use that model to predict with net new cases to the emergency department, which is likely to have COVID and not likely. They in fact have open sourced that model and made it available freely to others to be able to use that model for COVID. And just to double click a little bit more, say, well, how do they do that? I just want to walk through this because it gives you the sense of why cloud technology is a powerful way of building machine learning model before we go to the examples in education and in research. So what they did at Vancouver General is they moved their CT data into the cloud. And the reason they want to do that is because they want to apply machine learning tools that are in the cloud, that are on AWS, that they're not on a spinning disk in a data center. These are all tools that are built, and they're sophisticated tools that you can run. The same ones that Netflix uses are the same ones exactly that VGH used. And so the data is moved in. And here's the interesting thing. They were also using not just CT data, but using electronic health record, the charts. And so they uploaded all the chart data and used a tool called Comprehend Medical, which what it does is it reads the note and extracts knowledge from that note. It understands printed positives and printed negatives. It knows that this is a medication, the route, the dose. It is a knowledge graph. So Comprehend Medical is a tool from AWS. It creates a knowledge graph. And then they use that knowledge graph as part of their data AI/ML. And in fact, to ensure patient privacy, the system can also strip out, and they did. They stripped out all the patient identifiers before they built the model. And in fact, VGH had also collaborators across Canada. Maybe some of you were involved in this, and also collaborators in South Korea, China, in South America, somewhere I can't recall right now, Singapore. And they brought in data from all over the world, because the bigger your data set, the more accurate your model. Remember, with the CERN, we did 210,000 patients. I think they were at 4,000 in Vancouver, if I recall last time. And they built their model based on data from across the world, de-identified, in Vancouver and across Canada, all de-identified, moved into the cloud, and then those machine learning tools applied to build that predictive model. So when we talk about prediction, this is the idea of taking a training set, training a model, and then bringing unknowns to it to determine. San Diego, UCSD did that with chest x-rays for COVID. GE did it with pneumothorax. VisAI has done it with stroke. These are all tools that help in the detection because they had training data sets. They labeled them, the machine built a model, and then they used that model to actually bring in data examples of patients the model's never seen before, and then it can help determine. So that's, when we talk about prediction, whether predicting congestive heart failure, whether predicting likelihood of COVID, whether predicting likelihood of stroke, these are all based on data that's typically de-identified, moved into an environment that you can apply intense machine learning tools to it that are, I mean, to be fair, used by a Department of Radiology in Vancouver. I'm not trying to make it trivial, but it's not, you don't need to be a machine learning expert. You didn't go and study machine learning in university. These are radiology residents and radiology staff that use the tools that sort of point and click. It's called SageMaker Studio. You point, click, and you do it. So I just want to encourage you to explore and experiment. So now talking about exploring and experimenting, let's go ahead and talk about some examples in education and research. And in this space, so imagine if at the end, you're at the end of the semester, and you have now your students that have completed the semester, you have all their body of work that they've done all semester. You also know how they did at the end of the semester, whether they're rotation, or whether it's a typical in-class learning, that you have their body of work and you have the outcome. So what if then what you did is you took that outcome, again, these are, please assume de-identification as a given. We're not talking about individual level data. These are all de-identified because you're building models. You don't need to know it was Shez. You're just trying to build those models. So these are all de-identified. So you know the outcome of the semester, but you also have last semester data. And you can use those same machine learning tools to be able to convert that some of the data is discrete, like grades, assignment grades, but some of the data is non-discrete, like they may have asked questions via email, and they may have handed in assignments late or early. So there's metadata around the actual grade data as well. So it's not just grades of they got an A on this assignment and a B on that project, but rather the metadata around that is also available and used to build a model. And this was done at a university in the name will come to in a second, it's in the United States. They were able to predict with 82% accuracy, 2 weeks, building that model and then using it with other students as a test and then using it going forward. They're able to predict a student's outcome for a semester 2 weeks into the semester based on the data that is given to the model. And that basically is, they use that as a mode of doing more probing as to whether the student might need more assistance or whether there might be special additional lectures they might put because a certain number of students are all experiencing a certain challenge. The point being is that they've used a priori data, looked at student performance, anonymized, built a model, and then applied it to a validation data set to look at accuracy, and then use that as an additional input to support the educator in making decisions. Now, I know some of you here, whether it's in rotations or in classroom, you probably already know as well, based on your experience, you'll probably have an instinct of, that student's going to sail through, or I think I'm gonna have to work with that student. You probably know that. And the thing about this, if you go back to that model where through your training, through your experience, you've developed a model that's between your ears. It's in your brain, it's in your training. And the point here is that through providing these data points and these outcomes to a model in the machine, it can provide that input because after all, you might want that level of insights for someone who only has 6 months of educating experience versus 16 years. And that's the way that we often see organizations looking at machine learning, artificial intelligence. It's an adjunct to help in the decision-making process. It's not intended to make that decision. So that's an example that was in here's exactly using that model, applying it the same way we did it with what was done in Vancouver with electronic health record data. In this case, it was done with semester data and used all sorts of input. Another example in education, which is one thing I wish was around when I was going through school, was this is another one that was that's a model that was built, is that if you look at a student that's graduated and then look backward, because sometimes students transfer, and as they're transferring, they're looking at what courses are available and what courses can I take, what's the fastest path to graduation, would I qualify for this if I take these? And those are often questions that a model can easily answer as well. And so in this case, the model was built based on students. We have a little bit of an echo. I think someone's off mute. But what happened in this case is the data was used based on all the courses, the transfer course the student came in with. So they have a body of data there. And then all the courses they took to get to graduation for thousands of patients, thousands of students that passed. And based on that, built a model for quickest path to graduation based on inbound transfer or inbound from high school, sometimes with AP credits. And the students now use that tool to not only explore what they're interested in, but also be able to have the model provide recommendations. This particular school had 140 different programs that you could select from. And each of those programs had their course timings and everything would change. And so there's really no way to programmatically build this in software. But the model, the machine learning model they built, it's not, and again, it's not an if then, it's a model that's based on training data. And they're now using this to help students find their ideal path to graduation, either based on areas of interest or sometimes, quite frankly, on a desire to graduate quickly. Because if you've ever talked to students, or if you, I'm sure you remember when you were a student, there are tricks and tips that students develop and share with one another, how to navigate to a fastest way. Take this in the summer to that one over here. And, don't take this first semester, take that second semester. These are all become sort of urban knowledge or things that students know, but the model actually codified that and helped the university help students find the fastest path to graduation. So that was an example, two examples in the graduation space of using machine learning and modeling to be able to help, again, build these, go from narrative stories to discrete model knowledge graphs, from knowledge graphs to models, and then make that available to students. So let's go ahead and finish up with talking about research and some of the things that are going on. I'll give two examples there, and then we'll wrap it up and take some questions. In research, let's jump to, I think the example I put in here was from Vancouver. Again, it wasn't intentional, really, the two examples, not because I studied in Vancouver, but rather because these are terrific examples. There's a company, young company in Vancouver called Apcellera. Apcellera is a biotech company, and their mental model is that we have in our own, and as clinicians, you of course know this, we have in our own bodies, when you recover from an illness, you have in yourselves the antibodies needed to treat that illness in theory, because you recovered, at least in most cases. And their mental model is that in order to really develop the ideal therapy, we just need to look inside ourselves, to a recovered patient, to find and then to create that antibody as a drug and manufacture that. And back in January, when COVID was at its peak, at least in some parts of the world where it was at its peak, they got their hands on a plasma from a recovered patient and set out to identify the antibody, looking for a monoclonal antibody that bound to the spike protein of COVID, because the theory being is that if we can isolate that, we can make a drug out of that. And this is for, of course, therapy, not vaccine. And so they took that sample, spun it down, and had found 5.8 million B cells. And Apcellera has a special microfluidic technique where they can label antibodies in the B cell. And then what they do in the cloud is that in the machine and artificial intelligence they use is that they use computer vision on AWS to detect, to look through the entire cell to look for these tracers. So now, I'm sure some of you have done pathology, you look at a part of the microscope, it's hard enough to look at the entire scope. And now imagine you're scanning through the entirety of 5.8 million B cells. And this would take a really long time. They did it in 3 days. And because it was cloud-based, it's computer vision, and they scanned through 5.8 million B cells in 3 days and identified 2,200 cells that were producing antibodies. So far, so good. The first 3 days. And then what they did is they tore those cells apart and they sequenced the DNA of those antibody producing cells to identify the sequence for 500 specific types of antibodies. And so they've gone from 5.8 million B cells to actually now having sequence information on 500 antibodies. That second step took only 3 days. So first one, 3 days to identify 2,200 out of 5.8 million, and 3 days again with computing power to actually sequence them and to find the actual sequence for the 500 antibodies. Then what they have to do is, of course, it's not just any antibody. You want a monoclonal antibody, and you also want one that can be made in the labs. There's certain features. So they scan through the sequence of the DNA to identify what they knew through their experience, characteristics that are favorable to production in a lab. So they went from 500 antibodies. And then finally, to identify the single antibody cell line candidate that was a monoclonal, that was a great match to the spike protein. And it took them 6 weeks from blood bag or from plasma bag arriving till they had a sequenced, identified antibody that they, of course, then Apcellera partnered with Lilly, the pharma manufacturing company, to take it to clinical trials. And then I don't know what the latest is on what phase they're in, and of course, hopefully take it to production and manufacturing. So this is an example of the acceleration of research that can happen with the power of both AI, like computer vision, but also computing power. And then the last example I'll give, because it's very much here and now for an academic center that's doing research. And I wish I had this tool available when I was doing research. This is there's a tool that a company, Deep6 AI, built a tool using AWS technology for being able to read through charts and to identify patients that match inclusion and exclusion criteria. And so this example, there's a multi-center trial in the US where the first 120 patients, it took 6 months to recruit out of 29 sites. The 30th site that came on happened to be using this natural language processing. Remember, I explained earlier that Vancouver General Hospital uses this as well. It reads through the chart and identifies knowledge graphs from it. Then, of course, in this case, compares it to inclusion exclusion criteria. So the 30th site recruited 80 patients of this rare condition, relatively rare, in 6 months. And so that gives you the impression and the potency of being able to use machine learning and AI in things like clinical research. And in fact, to really take this to the next level, I was so impressed. I gave the actual site a call. They're based in California. Unfortunately, I can't say their name. Gave the site a call to really learn a bit more and found out a few more things. So in 2017, they had one full-time employee, one research coordinator, and they did one study in 2017. After they implemented this natural language processing technique of using machine learning and AI to look through charts for inclusion exclusion criteria, which of course then leads to consent and so on, that's assumed, they were able to do 10 studies with 2 staff members. And then in 2019, they were able to do 30 studies with 4. And these are orders of magnitude. This is operational excellence that's brought about by using machine learning and artificial intelligence. And so this is an example of really having a quantum leap forward in your performance at an academic center for research. I realized I added this one slide. I did this last week, so I want to tell you this one more example. This is a really terrific example, and I'll do this, and this will be my last one. So, Numerate is a partner company that works with AWS, and I don't know if you've ever, and some of you may be doing this in your research labs, but have you ever wondered how a certain chemical molecule is used to take to clinical trials? In other words, there are millions of molecules out there, small molecules, and how do we decide that that's the one I'm going to take to clinical trial for this cardiac condition? Well, it turns out that you have brilliant scientists that will work in a lab and spend 5 to 7 years canvassing through millions of molecular structures and the way the compound is absorbed, distributed, metabolized, eliminated in the body. They understand the chemistry of it. They understand the site properties of the receptor site, the 3D structure, maybe down to the genomic level. And they spend 5 to 7 years to really try to narrow down from millions of possibilities down to a few that then they would take to clinical trial. Well, what we did together with Numerate is took 128 million molecules. This was for a particular cardiac condition. And remember I talked about putting the data into a data lake and then using that to train a model. And so 120 million molecules put into the data lake, all their properties, the chemical properties, the way they're, again, absorbed, metabolized, distributed, eliminated, and also the information from the receptor site, its protein structure, 3D structure, as well as third-party data sets like open data registries from the globe that have genomic data about this receptor site and so on, and applied thousands of machine learning models. And we actually applied 10 CPU centuries of compute. That's 1,000 years of compute power applied in 1 year, and went from 128 million candidates for this particular cardiac condition down to 69 that would be a perfect fit within 1 year. It would have taken normally 7 years. And so going from 128 million candidate molecules down to 69, and then of those, a certain number were taken to clinical trial. This reduction of time to value across any part of the research value chain, whether it's in this early research, whether it's in clinical trials like I shared with you, whether it's in manufacturing, whether it's in digital therapeutics. I could spend all day talking about examples where cloud computing and power unlocks the ability to accelerate, at a level that's just I'm in this space, and if in December of 2019 someone said, "We'll identify an antibody and take it to clinical trial in 6 weeks," I would have said, "Well, someday." But this is the kind of compression that's happening with infinite compute and incredible machine learning tools available. These are all tools that are now new tools in the tool belt of researchers, clinicians, educators. And I would encourage you to dispel the myth of they're going to replace what I'm seeing across the world, from Argentina to UK, from Singapore to Vancouver. These tools are helping clinicians, physicians, researchers do what they do best, just to do it at an incredible rate. So that is the set of stories I was going to tell you about. I hope I've been able to sort of demystify a little bit of machine learning and maybe dispel some of the fear and doubt that might be out there. But there's a lot left to be done, and these are incredible opportunities for organizations like yourselves at McMaster and of course Merit. And thanks so much, Teresa, Sandra. I'll take questions that you might have, and we can go from there.
Thank you so much, Shez. That was very illuminating, very exciting for me to hear. Very sort of encouraging, positive sense about the future of healthcare. I see some more questions popping into the chat window, but if I may, I'm going to characterize some of the earlier questions around some themes to start with. So one is sort of this perception of AI. So in your experience in introducing AI or machine learning, or introducing some of this technology that you've described to benefit healthcare, what's your sense around how it's perceived, sort of with fear? So, the one person, one of our attendees was asking about any sense of intimidation. And so I'll add to that, maybe just even any sense of like if there are barriers on the end user side of things. So I'll stop there and let you.
Sure. Well, I think I understand the question, and because I can think of end users in two dimensions. One might be the end user, like the clinician, the physician, and then might be the end user being, if you will, the patient and the individual. Certainly, well, AI and prediction, of course, is in our lives everywhere. I mean, if you use any sort of a map, you're predicting the best route, it's AI. If you grab an umbrella one day, it's based on a prediction. In fact, all of this, everything I just explained is exactly the same model for predicting weather, predicting the best route, predicting how long it's going to take for you to get from place A to place B. So in some ways, it has infiltrated already in many different dimensions. And what we really see, what health systems and or health authorities are really asking us to do, when I think of the signals that we're getting, is around basically three things. I talked about predicting health events, and there's a great story of asthma. Depending on how much time there is, I might come back to. But for example, predicting asthma attacks as a way of improving quality and reducing cost. I am seeing a lot of places where organizations are saying the best way to reduce cost and improve quality is to predict an event, not to manage an event. And so we're seeing a lot of as physicians and clinicians begin to understand the tool is a prediction tool with a probability tool, that they're actually starting to ask the question, well, maybe if I could predict this, I could then improve care. If I could predict the person's going to have a diabetic foot ulcer, then maybe I could improve, So I do think that there is a lot in the literature, in the media, around what AI ML might or might not do. But when you really begin to talk to organizations that are doing it, they're doing things like predicting length of stay and admission, predicting the probability the patient will not show up for their appointment, predicting the probability that someone will be readmitted to the ICU, predicting if they're going to run out of ventilators in a certain time. So these, I had one hospital COO tell me, so and this is what she said, so let me get it straight. You can give me, this was our operations, you can give me tomorrow's dashboard today. Mm-hmm. It goes, you can give me tomorrow's bedboard today, or next week's bedboard today. You can tell me my bed utilization ED next Friday. You can tell that to me today. I mean, there is a probability associated with it, but as people begin to look at that and say, well, what would you do if you had that probability? And it's not like we've been doing that with time motion studies and doing all sorts, as classically people have been doing it. But this is where, when you really unpack what it's providing, is those insights. If you hone in on that word insights, it starts to lose some of this mystique and fear of, because insights are just that, what you do with that insight. I'll give you one really good example. I want to come back to that predicting clinic no-shows. And it also goes to the end user, to the patient. I think it's a great story because it also talks about our responsibility in society. So if you predict no-shows, what would you do with that data? This was a great discussion we had, and hats off to the organization that was doing this, that this is the organization I knew that had a chief ethics officer on their team. So if you predict clinic no-shows, you could take the route that some might think, which is, well, okay, just double book. If you think that Shez isn't going to show up for the clinic, and these appointments are important because we have a lot of people waiting, long wait times. So if you think Shez is not going to show up, then just double book. Don't airlines double book seats? But then you begin to realize, well, this is this organization that went through this methodical, thoughtful approach and said, yeah, but who's not likely to show up? They're likely vulnerable, disenfranchised. Maybe they don't have a car, they don't have a bus fare. And so if we double book and they do show up, then we have even less time with the vulnerable. And so they looked at it and said, you know what we need to do? We are going to use the prediction as a means of outreach to make sure they have the means to get there, that if they need a babysitter and so on. So what we do with prediction still defines our humanity. And that thoughtful exercise that organization went through is a delight to watch, because it was, yes, you can predict, but what I do with it is still a decision that I'm going to make as an organization, as a physician, as a clinician. And that exercise was really a reminder to me that it's still an input to either a person or organization to do the right thing.
Yeah, that's really, really amazing work that people are doing. And thanks so much for sharing those stories. I think they're really revealing to us to think through how to use this data, because telling the future has never been a strong suit of mine, at least. And if I could be augmented by that, I wonder what I might do if I knew how quickly my calendar fills up. Et cetera, right? I'm going to pivot over to another question. There's a couple of technical questions that I thought I grouped together. So there's a couple of folks that have asked a little bit around kind of sample size and also the ease of use with the tools. Now in AWS, I understand what you have is basic cloud-based tools that it's kind of like SPSS, where you kind of like click, drag, drop, and then you might use an algorithm. But maybe I'm oversimplifying it. So can you walk me through what it might look like and what kind of data prep you need to do in order to get it ready for if you're an aspiring there? We've got some radiology residency in the crowd to do their residency research project this way. What would that look like?
Absolutely, and by the way, I'm more than happy to put anyone in touch with the Vancouver team. They've told me I can do that. So if that comes to it, so there are tools. There are certainly tools that have. There's one tool called SageMaker Studio, and the other tool called Ground Truth. So when we talk about data labeling and data, what some will call data wrangling and data labeling, the tool is called Ground Truth, and exactly as it sounds, it's the idea that you label data with the ground truth, which is used for training. So yes, it's a user interface. It's not a command line where, if you're Unix buff, it's not that sort of a command line where I certainly could never get to learn well enough, but it is a graphic user interface that allows you to load your data during the training. And in fact, the Vancouver team did use Ground Truth for labeling the data. And then the user interface that builds the model, SageMaker Studio, it does all the recommendations for you. It looks at your data and asks you, what are you trying to do? Oh, you're trying to do image. You have categories like, I'm trying to do image recognition. I'm trying to do natural language processing. So as you click image recognition, then it'll preload all the optimized parameters for you. And so there's like 12 are you doing to do voice recognition? Are you trying to do text recognition? Are you trying to do image? All these pre-parameters. So you just pick the right one, click submit, and it says point to the data. You point to where the data lake is. It says point to the model, or it recommends one. You can train, and then it says train, and then you press another button. So it's actually about 3 clicks once you have your data labeled. Now I'm being serious, and in fact,
well, that's great. Yeah, I think that's what people want to hear.
Once you have data labeled in Ground Truth, it's 3 clicks. So anyhow, but it is a graphic user interface. There is a command prompt version for the true enthusiasts that want to roll up their sleeves and get into that sort of framework level, but I don't think I would venture there without some expertise in machine learning.
Okay, on that note, there's another technical question by one of our own postdoc fellows who is a computer scientist. So there's a lot of discussion around data privacy and protection in AI. How does AWS approach data protection and privacy? That being said, that is specifically, how do you, for non-tech savvy admin people who have data concerns and putting it into the cloud? I think you hinted at a little bit with what the Vancouver team did. They stripped it of identifiers and then loaded it up and basically labeled stuff with the COVID, not COVID, or whatever, right? Like that sounded like what they did with redacting the data. To take the metadata off and all the other stuff so that couldn't be used. But can you walk us through how this all works?
The privacy, the data privacy and security portion is actually simple, because AWS has a very, very specific position on this, which is not necessarily shared by others. And that AWS never looks at customer or partner data. We simply don't. We never open the payload. You have the encryption keys, you hold them. We have no idea if it's patient information in there or pictures of cats and bunnies. We have no idea. We don't look in customer. In fact, we don't use the customers, the organization data to build models. We don't monetize it. We don't learn from. We simply don't open the payload. It is the customers, the organization's data. It belongs to them, and they control it. So, and that's not like everybody else, but that's AWS's very strict DNA. And so that's point one. And also just to share that there's also some will ask, well, the data has to stay inside the bounds of the country. And yes, AWS has data residency in Canada. So if you're doing the work, because of the regulatory requirements for data sovereignty and data residency, if you're doing work in Canada, data stays in Canada. Some people might have wondered. So privacy and security, we don't look at the data, it's your data. We don't use the data, you build the data, you own the data, you do whatever you want with the data, and it stays in Canada. And then now we do have services that de-identify. That example I gave was Comprehend Medical. And we have those services that de-identify, not because we look at data and you might want to hide it from us, no, but because organizations want to collaborate with one another. And they told us, look, when McMaster and UBC want to collaborate, we don't want to identify the data, have identified data, we want to have de-identified data. So we really built that service so that you all could collaborate with one another and not have patient identifiers shared. We wouldn't have seen it anyways. So there's that difference between AWS view and then and you're right, Vancouver there was a multi-center model they were building, not just from across Canada, it was from across the world. And so their choice was to use the Comprehend Medical Service to de-identify the data so that it could be pooled, and then they could build models. And now, of course, when data labeling is happening, the residents would be looking at the images. And that's another reason to de-identify, because if you're labeling data from Ontario, you wouldn't want the patient's information seen by the resident in Vancouver. So the de-identification also helped with that collaboration among sites for the data labeling. That one has COVID, that one doesn't. It was all de-identified. So does that sort of capture both the AWS perspective and then the identification perspective?
Yeah, I think that kind of puts it all together. I think there's one other question that's more about, I guess the Royal College has been making some headway into thinking about AI and the future of AI and how it impacts on physicians and training. But maybe, do you have some thoughts on that as a Royal College fellow yourself? Like how do you see all of this folding in? Because we do have some trainees, and actually Anna, who's one of our trainees and joined Merit in her PGY 1 year, and I've already supervised her in a rotation. And so I know she's good people. And, she's wondering, like, how are we going to learn all this when none of our teachers know it either? And, I think that we could probably have some analogies across the board about things like that, but maybe what are your thoughts on that?
I'll share in two dimensions. One, the question around how will this all play out, and I'll come to training in a second. I think this is a mental model I use, and it actually makes good sense to me, which is, I think these AI models, these machine learning models are going to become like digital tests. You order a test, you're going to eventually just order a model. There'll be a time where there are too many models, and it's not like you can run every model on every patient. And I think it's going to come back to you as a clinician saying, I want to run the CHF model, this model, that model. You would actually, I think eventually we're going to order digital model tests. So I actually think that where we are going to be in the fullness of time. And then in terms of, well, what do I do as a trainee, as a student? A couple of things. One it's interesting now, and again, I feel like I'm talking about Vancouver all the time, but this is, it just happens to be, I think McMaster terrific, by the way, but no, this is not UBC. So in Canada, Amazon partnered with, it was based on work that was done with UBC. It wasn't me, just in case you're wondering. We partnered with UBC and created a Cloud Innovation Center. And why am I saying that? I'll come to in a second, which means, and it's we have 6 Cloud Innovation Centers in the world. In Canada, the only one currently is in Vancouver, UBC. And it's the only one focused on health and wellness. The other ones are different things. So I think one in Australia is on farming. I think there's another, there are other ones across the world, different manufacturing, I think in Germany. The one in Canada, in Vancouver, is focused on health and wellness. And its purpose is to fund innovative ideas as long as those that are doing it agree to the result becoming open source. So community good. But the thing is, anybody can apply from across Canada. It's not just for Vancouver or UBC. So first and foremost, I get it's not in your neighborhood, but in Canada, there's a construct for you can search it and find it, to actually submit an idea and then have Amazon and others actually work on your idea with you. And in this modern day and age, it doesn't have to, you have to be in Vancouver. So that's point one. Point two is we should look at what we want to do together with McMaster and with in your neighborhood. In my role, that's the part I love, which is strategically talking to organizations that want to do innovative things. So, and then finally, AIML University at AWS, they're literally everything you could possibly want to learn about AIML. All the courses are on AWS, and I'll give you the link later. I just don't have it with me. You can, all these courses, and there are many other ones too, but that's another place. But if you want to practically do a project, the quickest way right now is just to submit a one-page proposal to the Cloud Innovation Center. Or we'll look at, Teresa, with yourself and Sandra, we'll look at setting up something in your areas with Merit and others. I would love to do that.
Okay. All right, that's great. Sandra, I think you had a question there.
Yeah, so my question is, well, it's a question that I have, but I'm also interpreting from some of the technical questions around how much data, how do you select the data, and all of those issues. For me, the interpretation comes down to how do we ensure that the data aren't biased in some way? So this has been a question around AI continuing the stereotypes that we may have around patients and what's important, right? So you've really explained how teaching the system can be very simple in terms of just having a label and letting the computer sort it out. What do you see as the risks, though, for letting the computer sort it out and still end up with the same kinds of stereotypes that we have?
You know, when you talk about data in machine learning, you talk about 3 V's that are critical: volume, variety, and veracity. So in order to avoid the biases, you want to have as much volume as possible and as much variety as possible, and then veracity being the truth of the data. And so, and this goes to the discipline here is not to be compromising either of those V's when you're trying to build something that is, you're trying to have it so that it's diverse, if you will, a model that is not skewed to one way or another. The other thing that which you say actually denotes, and it is, this is an observation that surprises some people, is that models are actually local. You know how we talk about healthcare is local? When I was training, everything was possibly TB. When I went to Phoenix to my fellowship, I remember I said it could be TB. They all laughed at me like, TB? It can't be TB. And they were like, I was from Mars. And yet my entire residency was like, oh, that could be TB. Models are based on local. So if you really build a model, you couldn't, and I wouldn't advise you to just download a model from Singapore and use it in Vancouver. It'll call everything diabetes, because the prevalence of diabetes in Singapore is highest in the world, and the model is going to be skewed. So models are actually local, and it behooves organizations to realize that you actually want to do local model building. So you want to ensure you have volume, variety, and veracity of the local that you're in. So if we used your model in Singapore, it might be either biased inadvertently, or it might actually be plain wrong. And so this actually is, I think, from a student and a career sort of thinking in models in medicine, actually is actually encouraging, because it's not like this is going to get done anytime soon. Building models and understanding how to make them so they don't decay, so they're not biased, is actually a lifetime of work ahead of us.
I mean, I kind of think about it like clinical decision rules, and we have a lot of those in my specialty, which is emergency medicine. Most of them because the radiologists want us to cut down on tests. So the idea would be that in that way, a lot of those models, they've always sought for generalizability. And I think that what you're trying to say is that actually, now that we have this computing data, why not have really, really good, very deep local models that are refined in a way that can be very useful for your local population. So you can take that final step in every user's guide to JAMA in their user's guide. They always say, oh, does it apply to your context? You're like, no, derive it and actually fit it, bespoke it to your context from the get-go. And those models will always be better because it's driven by population level statistics that's actually linked to your local population and serving your population, rather than trying to be some generalizable truth across like multiple centers. Is that what I'm getting at? Is that we have that data now to do that?
And you can't, some people will use a general model as a primer to start the model training and then localize it. But bottom line is, you're spot on right. This atomic intelligence that can get embedded in workflow is ideal when it's refined to the local milieu, if you will. So yeah, totally agree.
That's upending the way we think about diagnosis for sure,
yeah.
Right? But it makes sense because I think Sandra can attest that she's an expert in decision making. If you ever need a consultant, just so you know. But the idea would be that a big part of what we do is we're trained, like you said, like in your training program, you were sensitive to TB because guess what? In Vancouver, that was actually really important because of local prevalence of disease. And so you became very good at looking for it, and other people would be like, I've never seen that. Same thing with diagnosing certain kinds of anemia. It's just not on a radar sometimes. So I think that's a point well taken. So I think that it's more and more the machines are getting more and more like humans, and that's, I guess, both scary and daunting at the same time. But I'll kick it back over to Sandra for closing remarks.
Well, actually, we've got a few minutes left, so I'm going to venture to ask one question that one of our attendees posted, which is, how can AI help manage pandemics? I might reframe that to sort of ask you, what's your perspective on what would it take for AI to actually manage us through a pandemic? What would it take for society to sort of allow AI to control us and take better care of ourselves to manage a disease like COVID?
You know, I would almost have thought that question was placed, but the pandemic alarm was rung on December 31st in Toronto. There was a company, Blue Dot, which uses AI to look at all published articles in the world, all blogs, all newscasts, looking for disease trends. They scan through every 15 minutes, analyze all publications. This is run on AWS, and looking for about 150 conditions. And on December 31st, they notified their customers that there is a pending outbreak. There is an outbreak underway in Wuhan, China. And within 8 days, they predicted, based on air travel patterns, which they also bring in, and train patterns, the next city will be Bangkok, which it was. On January 8th, they identified it. So actually, hats off to Canada and Blue Dot in Toronto, because they foretold before anybody. In fact, if you look at timelines, it was 2 weeks before even the CDC or the WHO. CDC was much later. WHO even talked about it. They actually rang the alarm bells. So I think we are in a place where AI ML can help predict things like a pending pandemic, and hopefully we come to a world where it improves the response as well, because it's not enough to ring a bell, you have to actually do something about it. So I think those are examples of what you might be called AI surveillance, and I mean surveillance and medical surveillance, that will help us predict global conditions and help us avoid things. And maybe this result of COVID is that we actually start to pay more attention, because again, you can make a prediction. Go to that example of the predicting no-shows to a clinic visit. It's what we do with that prediction that makes us. So the machines are going to be able to help us make these predictions, but we have to have the political will and the volition to actually act on them. So I think it'll always be a combination of people, process, and platform. The platforms can do magic, or what appears to be magic, but the people and process part are the sisters of that platform. So I would say that I wouldn't think that the machines themselves they will always be part of the input to what we do as people.
Great, thank you. Well timed. We are right at the end of the hour, so perfect talk. Thank you so much again for sharing your time with us, Dr. Partovi, and your expertise. You've certainly dispelled some misconceptions. So for everyone here, we did record this. The video will be available shortly after some review, editing, and approval. And other than that, any resources that Dr. Partovi wanted to share, we will also add to that link or make available to this community. Again, go to merit.mcmaster.ca to look for future events on education research. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Teresa, Sandra. Take care.